Okay, I propose that we start this session. Yes? Okay. So it is now my great pleasure to introduce our two recipients of the Social Choice and Welfare Prize this year. The selection committee was composed of Arunava Sen, Silvia Papai, Ariel Procaccia, and Pietro Ortoreva, and myself. Let me introduce briefly the two scholars, prominent scholars, young scholars who we have with us today. So Jamie Morgenstern did her PhD in computer science at Carnegie Mellon in 2015 and is now assistant professor in the Paul G. Allen School of Computer Science and Engineering at the University of Washington after some years at Georgia Tech. And she has served as area chair and on the program committee of many conferences in her field. And as I gather, you'll tell me if I'm wrong, this is the equivalent for economists to being an associate editor in a journal or something like that, right? So Jamie is a leading specialist of two distinct questions. The first one is the social impact of machine learning. So how to make sure that the use of machine learning doesn't worsen structural inequalities that we have in society already in the current institutions. For instance, she has obtained results on the trade-off between optimality and fairness in learning, and she has found algorithms that simplify data sets without introducing a bias against certain groups of certain categories of gender, race, and so on. And the other question is how, conversely, machine learning is affected by people's behavior. In particular, people feed these algorithms or these procedures with data, and this may alter the working of these procedures over time. And she has broad interest, and she has also published on mechanism design, in particular on auctions and on fair division, and yeah, so broad interest, and this is our first recipient. And the second one is Gabrielle Carroll, who has a PhD from the MIT in 2012, and is now an associate professor in the economics department at the University of Toronto after getting tenure in Stanford, right? And he's an associate editor of Econometrica, Theoretical Economics, and a member of the board of editors at the American Economic Review. Gabriel is a leading specialist of robust mechanism design, such as when the designer doesn't know all the details of the environment or of the distribution of the agent's characteristics, and does not have Bayesian beliefs, but seeks to protect herself against the worst possible case, like, for instance, adopting a max-min approach. And so in spite of the complications that this entails, Gabrielle has shown that simple solutions, for instance, linear contracts in moral hazard settings, remain optimal under general assumptions. And more generally, I would say Gabrielle seeks to liberate mechanism design from restrictive assumptions, and he wants to develop a general approach that is a little bit akin to the canonical Arrow-Debreu framework, in which you have very general assumptions and no particular assumptions about functional forms and things like that. So they will tell us more about these things. I won't take more time, but now I would like to give them the prize. So it's a new formula. You haven't seen this one yet. So this is the middle. And let me give first one to Jamie. And so it's the same on this side, but the name is different on the other side. Great, and without further ado, I propose that we listen to Jamie first, and Gabrielle after that. Yeah, thanks. Okay, thank you. So that should be.
Good. I appreciate the feedback. Anyway, thank you so much for this lovely invitation. Very honored by the award. And when I received this award and sat down to think about what I might want to tell you all about, I had a bunch of thoughts. It's true that some of my work when I was a PhD student looked at fair division, sort of in the classical sense, also some things about voting, things on auctions, but most of the work that I've been doing for the last several years has been looking at questions about machine learning systems and sort of socio-technical systems. So I figured I would tell you a little bit about sort of the misuses of sort of machine learning frameworks and sort of how that interacts with a bunch of systems that you might care about. So the main takeaway, if you remember nothing else from what I'll talk about today, is that machine learning systems, just like mechanism design, just like any other problem you've probably ever thought about, makes predictions, the veracity of which really hinges upon the assumptions that are made in the design of those systems. Okay? So just like if you're designing your favorite voting system, if you slightly change the way you frame axioms or slightly change your assumptions about people's preferences or people's behavior, you should really expect something completely different on the other end. Right? So if these modeling assumptions are sufficiently wrong, the predictions that can be made by machine learning systems can be very misleading and very problematic. And many of these consequences are generally shouldered by minority populations or populations that have already historically been disadvantaged. Okay? So I would imagine many of you know this already, but I just want you all to walk away knowing that you are like 95% of the way there towards already being able to like claim that you do research in machine learning. Okay? So that is goal number 2 of the talk. So what is machine learning? All it is that you have a sequence of data generated by some process, and you're trying to find a pattern in that sequence which continues to hold in future data generated by the same process. Okay? So, there are many, many examples of these sorts of systems which are deployed probably on various devices on your person right now, right? Including systems that are trying to predict where the worst traffic jams in Mexico City are, and where you should avoid or where you should be trying to route yourself. Also, every time you log into the New York Times or any of your favorite news outlets, you're probably getting various types of content which is personalized to you, be those advertisements or sort of the ranking of news for you, these sorts of things, or whether you're looking, watching or listening to some kind of media, and that same platform is recommending information to you, right? And machine learning has also used these basic finding of statistical patterns and employing them in future prediction problems, also used to help speed up vaccine development and do all sorts of things in healthcare, right? So these are not sort of just systems that are being used in ways that don't impact our daily lives. They really are impacting so many things that we interact with every day. So I would be remiss if I didn't give you at least a couple of technical slides. So let me be slightly more precise when I say, what is machine learning? Suppose we have a sequence of data, x1, y1 through xn, yn, that's generated according to some process that I'm not really specifying, right? Pick a function, which you think of this function as capturing some pattern in that data. And what do I mean by capturing a pattern in the data? We want f to minimize some function g when f is applied to a future data point drawn according to that sequence, right? Like condition on having seen that first set of n data points, and maybe even condition on the pattern that we chose. Now, the sequence generator can generate another point in the sequence and see how well the thing that we learned as a pattern, see how well it actually does in terms of predicting what happens next. Right? So this should look relatively familiar to most of you if you have advanced degrees in economics. Right? This should feel like the generalized method of moments and lots of other frameworks that you've seen in your favorite econometrics class. Right? And the reason I just wanted to be, I want you all to walk away knowing that you already do things that most people would refer to as machine learning. Okay. The only things you may not be as familiar with, I'm glad I'm getting at least some smiles. Okay, so the only things that you might not know how to do, which is why they pay some people the big bucks. Well, one, people know they're doing machine learning, so now you know, now you can make the big bucks. Second of all, the other pieces which sort of formulate what machine learning is sort of discussing the rates of this kind of process, right? So when can you talk about sort of how well the process you're actually analyzing does when you have a finite amount of data, not just looking at limiting behavior, right? So rates of convergence, lots of statistical analysis there, and sort of computationally how to find a function which minimizes this G applied to a new point from the sequence, right? So that's sort of a rich field of optimization, and that's something that in general you've probably thought about somewhat less, and that's sort of what fills hundreds or thousands of people's minds when thinking about sort of machine learning research. Okay, so I want to name each of these things, right? So I want to refer to these sequences of data and sort of the assumptions we build in to these sequences as what I'll call a data generating process, okay? So we have a data generating process which gives us some training data, right? And it will also give us the future data point on which we actually care about future performance. And I want to talk about this function which captures a pattern in our training data. I'm going to call that a hypothesis. Okay? These names don't matter. I'm just going to use them as like quick references. Okay? And then finally, this function G, which is actually evaluating how well we are doing on capturing that pattern, I want to call that an objective function, right? No special naming here, but these are just some things to sort of clarify that we are using the same nomenclature. Okay, so apologies, I don't know why that's working. So the point of this talk is to think about some of the socio-technical consequences in terms of choices of objective functions and data generating processes, which are usually incorrect, right? So we probably formulate some model anytime we're solving some kind of problem, and we know that the model is incorrect, but it's worth sort of thinking about some of the downstream consequences of making incorrect assumptions when it comes to data generating processes or when it comes to optimizing a particular objective function when in fact another one might be the more relevant one for our task at hand. Okay. Right. So just to recap, right, we know that every model we ever write down is wrong. Some of them are useful, but if we write down one which is wrong, we should have some ideas about some of the downstream consequences of doing so in sort of these high stakes, possibly high stakes systems that touch lots of humans' lives. Great. Okay. So that was the introduction that I wanted to give to you. And now I'm just going to give you a few examples of sort of how, bad assumptions about how the data generating process you're interacting with might have some consequence, right? And then also some of the consequences about using an objective function which might not actually match the thing you care about, okay? Okay, great. So just remember, data generating process is just the way we assume these sequences of data are generated, right? And also we assume that that process is going to continue after we see some prefix of data, and maybe even conditioned on sort of the decision we make, the function or the pattern that we try to find. And that's the thing we're going to look at first, right? So one data generating process that I'm sure you're all quite familiar with is just one which is IID. Right? So we just imagine we have a training data set, which is, each point of which is drawn IID from some fixed distribution. That's maybe thrown at like a black box, which we can think of as machine learning, which outputs some hypothesis, right? That's just a function that goes from x's to y's. And then we can think about applying the hypothesis F to new examples drawn from the same distribution, ignoring the y's, right? We can think about the same distribution generating x's, but ignoring y's, and see what our hypothesis says, right? Our hypothesis can give us values, which we can think of as, y values for each of those examples. And the assumption we often will make if we're thinking about an IID data generating process is that if we're going to look at sort of how well our hypothesis F does, we want to assume x1 through xm prime are drawn according to this distribution, the same distribution over x's, and that the y's are also drawn according to the same distribution conditioned on our x's, as was true in our prefix in our training data set. Right? So the IID-ness of this data is both across, like within our training data, and the choices we make when we choose a hypothesis F, we're assuming that that doesn't have anything to do and doesn't affect the distribution that we'll see after when we're trying to evaluate how well our model actually works. We're assuming that the distribution that we actually care about performance upon is the same as the one that we got training data from. Okay? So this is a very standard setup. This is what you use in any number of Bayesian setups. And even if you're not sort of working with a prior that you know of, right? This is a very standard setup in machine learning and statistics and lots of parts of economics, right? But I imagine all of you are also quite aware that most of the time we're thinking about learning something from some data set, right? This is not going to be a perfect assumption that captures exactly the world we're living in, right? So in general, if you're wondering, do I believe my data should look something like an IID data generating process? The short answer should probably be no in almost every circumstance. But here are some hallmarks that I think are particularly important to think about when you're trying to determine, is it the case that the particular application I'm thinking about is IID enough so that sort of the rich mathematical underpinnings and consequences of that framework are relevant for what I'm thinking about. So the first one, which I'm sure you've all thought about, or it's not so far afield from what you've thought about, does the data, do the people who are generating the data or the data itself have preferences over our predictions? If so, I think it's reasonable to believe that either our training or our test data might shift as a result of whatever hypothesis we learn. Right? So, for example, if I am trying to predict who is likely to have some disease, and as a consequence of that prediction, the people who I think have that disease get access to certain resources that other people don't, right? You might imagine that the distribution over the way people interact when they know that they're going to be receiving more resources if they are predicted to have this disease will be different than if not, right? So that's sort of one hallmark example of, an IID assumption is generally going to be a pretty poor one unless you happened to design a machine learning pipeline, which is, for example, strategy proof, right? But most of the time, most of machine learning has not been designed to be strategy proof. Okay. So I want to talk a little bit about one particular example of some work that sort of has this flavor, where like IID assumptions made by people who are doing machine learning can lead to really unintended consequences. Okay, so, but before I do that, I want to say also that there are sort of other reasons that you might expect IID data sets to not, or particular data generating processes to not be IID, right? ML systems might inherently change the way they gather data as they operate. And if they do that, right, maybe on Monday I decide I want information about people who live in California, so I do a lot of interaction with people in California. And then I realize I don't know anything about people in Utah, so I sort of do a lot of A/B testing for people in Utah, right? The data on Monday and Tuesday are no longer IID. Right? And lots of ML systems sort of actively gather data from different parts of the space as they operate. And if they do that, your data is not IID. Okay. And even if you don't sort of have these kinds of critical, obviously non-IID settings, right? The passage of time by itself leads to drift, right? From distribution to distribution. On features, right, these X's that I'm talking about, you might imagine Monday, everyone really likes to buy headphones, and Tuesday, not that many people are buying headphones. On labels, right, maybe on December 24th, everyone's buying headphones, and on December 25th, only audiophiles are buying headphones because they're on sale, right? So, I think it's generally quite reasonable to assume that our data sets are quite rarely IID, right? And our data generating processes are quite rarely IID, even though that's where a vast majority of the statistical literature on machine learning lives, right? And just to give, yet another example of how like data's preferences might lead to non-IID data, right? If we learned that if we provided a coupon to people below the red line, those people would buy something that they wouldn't otherwise buy, and then we deployed that, you might suddenly find a bunch more people below that red line because they're looking to get a coupon for buying the same object, right? So in general, right, this is just trying to suggest that you should think about sort of when IID assumptions are more or less realistic for your problem. Okay. So I want to say just a couple of minutes about one particular model that was studied fairly recently in the literature, which shows sort of why sort of thinking about like an IID data generating process can lead to really underserved populations, okay? So if we imagine we're in a world where the data generating process, we assume it's IID and maybe a mixture of two different distributions, right? Maybe there is a majority population and a minority population, and you know, a 1 minus alpha fraction of the data we see comes from the minority, comes from the majority, and an alpha from the minority, right? If the learner just tries to minimize, they try to pick a hypothesis to minimize their objective function on their current distribution, right? If we're in a world where a population might stop participating if the performance of the system is too poor upon them, some very weird things can happen in these sorts of dynamics, right? So a learning algorithm just picks a hypothesis. It presumably will have somewhat better performance on the larger population, which means that the smaller population, if the performance for them is very poor, they might choose to either leave to some other service or choose to say that the service is not sufficiently worthwhile to them to use at all, right? Which then means that the next, you know, if the learning algorithm or the learning player is choosing to update their model in some way, right, based on their new population that they're serving, they will have yet less priority given to optimizing the performance on the smaller population, right? And in general, right, this can lead to, in a lot of cases, right, if we have imbalanced population sizes or, you know, any number of other different environments, right, modeling future data as IID can lead the learner to pick a function which only optimizes for one population and only captures patterns for that one population. And that can be problematic both for the learner, if they actually care about market share, and for the population that doesn't actually receive sort of even commensurate, you know, it's not like they get an alpha fraction of the optimization power, right? In this kind of world, they actually get absolutely nothing in equilibrium. Okay. So I want to say just a couple of minutes about sort of a natural generalization of this where the consequences aren't quite as negative, but they still have sort of a similar flavor, right? And this is with some really amazing colleagues of mine who I'll talk about just a bit at the end. So that was a world in which there was sort of a single learning algorithm, right? And anyone who wants to even call themselves kind of an economist would probably come up next and say, well, the problem was you didn't have any competition, right? Basically, the one population didn't have a reasonable outside option, didn't have a reasonable person in the market who was providing a service for them, right? So a natural question to ask is, if there are several different people who are picking hypotheses, right? You might imagine that competing for the largest market share might lead them away from sort of ignoring one population and totally optimizing for the other. So if for example, let's say I have like a music recommendation system, right? That music recommendation system, if it only works well for people over the age of 40, right? That's not going to be a great solution if you're trying to capture the entire market, right? Because some new upstart is likely to come in and say, hey, well, I have a really great recommendation system for people under 40 and the kinds of music they like. Right? And if they do as good of a job on that population and no worse on the other population, you would imagine that they would drive them out. Right? And there are some cases in which that might occur, right? But even so, right, if basically the learning algorithms, right, the people who are picking these hypotheses aren't really carefully modeling the dynamics of the populations moving between the two different firms or the two different hypotheses, we still get very weird equilibria that are much more stable than the ones you might think of as like sort of the competitive equilibria. In a lot of cases here, we'll actually see that, suppose we have two populations and they move slowly towards whichever hypothesis works better for them, right? And we have two hypotheses, and the hypotheses are basically just being selected to be sort of optimal with respect to G on the current populations that learning algorithm is serving. We will often see sort of segregated equilibria of those kinds of dynamics, right? That all of population 1 will end up at one of the hypotheses, and all of population 2 will end up at another, right? And I at least from my perspective, that's a little bit surprising, right? So if the learning algorithm, again, or the learners don't implicitly or explicitly recognize that there are these dynamics that are taking place, and they're not sort of going to continue to see IID data, right? There are very unintended consequences that can take place, right? They can sort of capture a very segregated part of the market, and that's actually much more stable than the sorts of equilibria where we both have sort of exactly the same performance on both populations. Okay. Right, so that's all I wanted to say about that. Okay, so now I want to say just a bit about another way in which sort of IID assumptions about training data might lead one astray. Okay? And in particular, I want to think about this idea that data, especially if we're thinking about like, I don't know, field economics or anything that's gathered on the internet, presumably there are actually like collections of data sets as opposed to like one specific data set that you're looking at any particular time, right? And this will also sort of generalize and extend to ideas that live in spaces where perhaps we know that we've gotten a lot of data from the upper right-hand portion of the XY plane, and we intentionally go and try to gather data from parts of the space we know we don't have, right? Just unioning that data together doesn't suddenly make it IID from like the joint distribution. I mean, you could probably do something to that extent, but that's not really the way these things work. Okay, so one application that might be worth keeping in the back of your head is that there's some kind of emergent disease, and we're trying to learn about it. And the kind of data we have is actually gathered in hyper-local health facilities across North America. Right? We have one hospital in Juneau, we have one hospital in Columbus City, I don't know where that is, one hospital in Phoenix, one in Edmonton, I'm guessing, I don't remember where I threw these on the map, right? But all of these different hospitals are capturing data about this emergent health phenomenon, but everything about these hospitals might be quite different. The populations they're serving are different. The set of tests they have are different. The set of various other features that they're capturing about their populations are going to be very different. They'll have different resources. The rates at which this emergent disease is transpiring will be different. In more urban versus rural places, the emergent health phenomenon might behave very differently outside of the hospital environment, right? And an interesting question is sort of how can we use all of this data in a meaningful way, as opposed to just trying to like glom it all together and hope things work out, right? Because that's definitely at least one of the things that some people would try. That might not be the thing that anyone in this room would try, right? But we can also presumably do better than just saying, okay, we have some other place in North America that we're trying to like make predictions about this emergent health phenomenon, try to find like the hospital data set which is most similar to that new thing I'm trying to predict upon. I presumably can do something more clever than that, right? And maybe I can actually learn something better from the union of these data sets than I could from any one of them. Also, in the world of machine learning, there are lots of cases in which we have observed that people have designed some kind of model, realize it only works well for people who are over 5 feet tall and standing on 2 feet, and then after the fact want to go back and fix it. Right? This is a pretty common paradigm within the context of large-scale organizations that produce these models, right? And one of the ways that you can think about how people often interact with these sorts of things is, maybe you observe that a model you have or a hypothesis you have performs very poorly for some population. And some of the interventions you might take might be to gather some new data about that population on which your hypothesis doesn't work very well, right? and then try to use that alongside your old data set to do something better, right? But if you don't do that carefully, right, there's going to be all sorts of possibly unintended consequences of that, even if your goal was trying to improve performance on this one population. Okay, so what do we want to assume might differ between these distributions? I want to assume that pretty much anything could change, right? The distribution over the set of features we see might change, that the distribution of Y conditioned on X might change too. Some of the hospitals might be gathering additional features that other hospitals are not gathering, and possibly many other things, right? So I don't want to make very many assumptions about what might be different between these different data sets, right? Which means IID-ness is definitely out the window, right? Okay. So what can we do with data that looks like this? And I want to suggest to you to sort of do some thought experiments about what might happen if you pretend stuff's IID. There are all sorts of things that can go really awry there. And standard uniform convergence, the sort of theory that we have that sort of talks about what we do when it's IID, is not super relevant. And at least some of the data that we have in terms of training data cannot follow the future distribution, right? Because we have data that's being drawn from different distributions. Okay, so one formal model to think about this is the following. Suppose we have two different distributions which are going to be generating training data for two different hospitals, say. One thing we might ask is whether it's possible to do well for any distribution which is not too far from both of those distributions, right? That's going to be a world in which we can actually learn something meaningful from both of our training data sets, better than what we could maybe do from either data set by itself. So you might just want to build a hypothesis that tries to perform well on all of the distributions in that space, as opposed to one specific fixed distribution, which is equal to one of those distributions. Okay. And the main result of this work is just that you can do that, right? There's actually like a computationally efficient way to do that, and it's sort of a statistically meaningful question in a lot of different cases. And this kind of result is essentially hedging. It's saying we know that these distributions that we're generating our training data are different. And furthermore, we know that the new distribution that we're actually trying to optimize our performance upon is also going to be different. So let's try to hedge that and make sure that we're sort of doing as well as we can on as many distributions as we can. And as many distributions as we can, the natural place to put that is the distributions that are not too different from either of those data sets, or the distributions that generated the training data sets. Okay? Okay. There's also some nice consequences of this that actually you can utilize sort of those additional features that one of the data sets had and not another, but that's sort of beside the point of this work. Okay. There's also a really nice corollary if you care about sort of equalizing performance across different populations. If you only have demographic information on one of your data sets, but you're hoping to sort of approximately equalize how much you care about optimizing for different demographic groups, you can do something meaningful here too. Okay. Okay, so, sorry. Okay, so now I just want to say just 1 or 2 minutes about one last thing, which is the idea that using objective functions that don't accurately capture things you might really care about will also lead to some unintended consequences. So it's important to spend a bunch of time thinking about the objective function you throw at your particular machine learning problem. Okay, and just reminder again, objective function is just this thing that we're trying to minimize that's evaluating how well we do in terms of how well we do finding a pattern and seeing whether that pattern continues to hold on future data, right? Lots of objective functions you've probably seen are expected differences, expected, things that look at sort of how well you're doing predicting the label Y from features X, right? And all of the examples I gave here are expectations over something, right? And one way you can think about that is that these objective functions are all averaging across uncertainty over future data, right? You can sort of think of those as sort of an average utilitarian view of the future predictions you're going to be making, right? That you're trying to sort of minimize the error you have over your entire distribution for your future predictions, right? And you can sort of think of if individuals care about their own personal sort of how well this hypothesis is doing for predicting for them, right? You can think of this specifically as an average kind of utilitarianism if you think of these following functional forms as their actual individualized utility functions. Okay, so there are lots of downsides to optimizing for average prediction. And the one of them is that it often sort of makes one think that there's a false dichotomy between trading off between accuracy on two different populations. But also, it has sort of a feature that I'm sure you're all already aware of, which is, if I have a huge population and I can get a 1% improvement, I can go from 90 to 91% accuracy, that will generally be preferable to making a 50% improvement on a much smaller population which had much lower accuracy to begin with, right? This is just sort of, because we're averaging over a larger group, a much smaller improvement, even if it's like a much smaller improvement where they were already doing very well, will generally be preferred. Max-min objectives, on the other hand, will mitigate some of these issues. If instead of saying, I'm just trying to maximize or minimize G over my entire distribution, maybe it's the case that I want to take into account that there are different populations on which I actually do care a lot about my performance, and try to do as well as possible on the one which is worst off, right? And these sorts of things are really nice and elegant, and they don't have sort of the same degree of focus in the machine learning literature, although all of you have thought about various types of maxi-min things for fair division and other things. But they also have a really nice place in some of these statistical places. Okay, so I'll go ahead and skip this last thing, but there's a really slick algorithm for sort of optimizing for maxi-min things, which I'm happy to tell more of any of you about offline. Okay, so in conclusion, right, when you all go out and do your next consulting gig where you say you're a machine learning researcher, maybe, I don't know, economists might be the only people in the world who that won't increase your average consulting rate, but you all know how to do machine learning, but the assumptions you make when designing a machine learning process and analyzing it are going to be really crucial, especially if these systems touch humans. And there are solutions which are possible. I don't want you to go away thinking that I just said bad things can happen. You just have to be careful and think carefully about some of these assumptions you're making and sort of when you would expect them to fail and what the pitfalls might be. And with that, I'd like to thank you all very much and look for all the people, especially on this top row. They are junior and they are amazing. So when you run into them, please say hello. Thanks.
So thank you so much, and we are great with respect to time, so we have time for questions. Maybe I can venture one. So when you discussed the objective functions, you went from a sum to a max-min. I was expecting something that would be more like putting a special weight on the minority population or something like that.
Yeah, so there is a relationship between these things, right? So the cute algorithm that I flipped between, because I wasn't sure whether I was supposed to go 40 or 45 minutes, basically shows a neat way to go between these, right? So if we have a sum and it's an unweighted sum, one way to move towards max-min is just to increase the weights on the population on which you're doing worse. And the really cute algorithm that I was going to tell you about is essentially, if you look at your current objective value on all the different groups you care about, look at the one on which you're currently performing worst, increase the weight a little bit. And that will converge to a max-min solution. Yeah?
Then what would you do if you want to take into account the fact that people belong to different groups, and that so that they can belong to different kinds of minorities?
There's no inherent problem with this specific technical problem. Intersectionality causes all sorts of additional difficulties, both from a technical and socio-technical space. Here, I think this approach would work fine for that. Although you would have to be a little bit careful in determining, okay, suppose, you know, a woman of color. If you see that you're working, you know, your system is working worst for women of color, right? One thing you could do is you could, you know, increase the weight on all of your women of color in your data set, right? Or in your training set or what have you. You could also do it just on women or just on people of color, but probably the most direct way to do it would be to upweight the people in the sort of intersection of groups that you're talking about.
When you're considering the two-cup population, do you ever use anything akin to Nash utility, Nash product, where we multiply utility rather than take away that?
Yeah, so that's a good question. And there has been work that has looked at that. I think, and in general, sort of p-norms, right? Various ways of like aggregating across, you know, if I'm applying some function, and then aggregating that function's value on a bunch of m data points. There are a bunch of ways you can aggregate them. And I totally agree that, like, you know, thinking about Nash products or various other things are also interesting approaches to consider. Yeah, and there has been a bit of work in that space.
Great, so thank you so much, Jamie. And congratulations again. So the floor is Gabrielle now.
Okay, try to keep track of time too. Thanks so much. It's very much an honor to be here. So I'm also going to give a sort of a survey talk, and this is going to be based loosely on an essay that I wrote for this book, to which I think a number of people in this room have contributed, The Future of Economic Design, several years ago. So that essay was just a few pages, so now I have a chance to elaborate a little bit. So most of my work, as Mark already mentioned, is on robustness in mechanism design. And mechanism design and social choice are not exactly the same thing. They overlap significantly, but they are also distinct. I'm not sure exactly where one draws the line, so I'm going to try to give a talk that sort of bridges both. Warning in advance, talk is going to contain some facts, but also a lot of opinions. So I don't expect that you will necessarily agree with the opinions, but I hope that they provide food for thought. So the first thing that I'm going to do is to describe an ambitious, maybe foolishly ambitious vision of where social choice and mechanism design, kind of writ broadly, might go in the future. And then I will give at least one example of somewhat recent work that I think sort of expresses that vision. I would like to give more examples, but there are time constraints. And then after that, I'll try to focus a little bit more narrowly on robustness in mechanism design, where most of my own work is, and I'll talk about several examples, both some of mine and one or two by others, and I'll try to talk about how this literature fits into the broader agenda. Okay. So when you think about mechanism design, this is a theoretical field that has had many potential areas of application, and some areas in which it has definitely had a concrete, measurable impact on real-world institutions, real-world mechanisms, right? Particularly in the sort of market design field, the matching markets, auction design. But potential applications of mechanism design are much broader than this. So we could think about voting systems, legislative committee structures, judicial procedures, protocols for arbitration or for international negotiation, the list goes on, right? And many of these are things that we would think of sort of squarely in the social choice field, right? Social decision-making institutions. And it would be wrong to say that mechanism design theory, or the academic theory has not influenced practice in these areas, but arguably it has had less influence on practice at a detailed level than the areas that are on the left. Okay? We can be sad about this, or we can view this as an exciting opportunity for future expansion. So I think the question that faces us, if we want to be optimistic, is what should we do to make mechanism design theory speak to a wider range of applications and sort of fulfill its potential? And so the view that I would like to push is that we need new kinds of models, right? In particular, sort of in the areas on the left are ones where, in many cases, we have applications that map quite closely to the kinds of theoretical models that we work with. Many of the applications on the right are ones where, like, the real world is just so complicated that it's very difficult to map it to our textbook models. Arguably one source of difficulty is that in many areas of potential application for design, we are accustomed to working with sort of very simple, stylized, structural models with particular functional forms with particular structures. Right? So I think about models of information aggregation, like in a sort of Condorcet jury theorem type of setting, right? We have, say, two possible states of the world, and everybody receives a conditionally IID signal. Think about models of information acquisition in committees. We often tell stories like, okay, somebody is ignorant of the state of the world, they can pay a cost and then learn the state of the world perfectly, or they learn it with some probability. Maybe the state of the world is normally distributed and you get a signal that has some normal noise and you pay a cost that's proportional to the precision of your signal. Another common example is the rational inattention model, where costs are proportional to the reduction in entropy of your beliefs. I think about models of communication and delegation in organizations, a la Crawford-Sobel. We often assume states of the world are one-dimensional, states and policies live in the same space. We often even assume people have quadratic preferences over the space. Right? For most applications that we would think of for these kinds of phenomena, these kinds of stylized models are ridiculously oversimplified, and we know that, right? And this is not to say that we should add more parameters, add more dimensions to make things more realistic, right? So if I think about, say, the first example, right, information acquisition, or information in juries, right, it's just not the case that there's only two possible states of the world, either defendant is innocent or the defendant is guilty, right? A state of the world should describe everything that's going on in the world. There's lots of pieces of evidence. Jurors know something about one piece of evidence. They might not know something about something else. They might have information about the validity of the evidence that other jurors know about. They might even know something about the other jurors' ability to process that evidence. Right? If I think about a setting of information acquisition, I don't know if you're a firm deciding whether to make some investment to develop a product. You want to learn about the market for this product a year from now, the market for the product 5 years from now, learn about what your competitors are doing. How do I even think about all of these different aspects and how they interact? Right? So my point is not that we need complicated parametric models to model complicated reality. It's that no parametric model is realistic for many applications, and we would like to have language to talk about that. And in many cases, we seem not to, right? So we work with stylized models because they're useful to express ideas and intuitions clearly, but sooner or later, if those intuitions are really valid, it should be possible to express them in models that can accommodate the complexity of real-world environments. And maybe we say, well, we don't know how to write down those kinds of sort of weakly structured models, as I'm calling them. We just don't have that language. But potentially we can develop it. So in some areas of economic theory, we do have, so I think about general equilibrium, as Mark mentioned in the introduction, right, as one example, right? So there, the goods can be anything, there can be lots and lots of them, people's preferences can be arbitrary. We can state the first and second welfare theorems in this very general framework. Okay, so I would like to try to think about what mechanism design might look like in a world where we impose less parametric structure on our models, and hope that this might help the theory speak to applications that it currently doesn't know how to speak to. So I said I would give one example of recent work that I think sort of expresses this spirit. It's going to looks very different from the sort of familiar write down an objective and optimize, or write down axioms and see what mechanisms they characterize. This is a paper by Sylvain Chassaing in 2013 titled Calibrated Incentive Contracts. So Chassaing is interested in the dynamic agency problem, a dynamic moral hazard problem. So the principal here is a person who wants to invest her wealth. So each period she has some amount of wealth W that she can invest across several assets whose returns are going to be random. Okay, and so, let's see, does this work? Yes. So she can invest ATK in asset K at time T. So across all assets, that has to add up to W. And then if RTK is a gross return on that asset, this is what she has at the end of the period. And the returns are not known at the beginning of the period. The agent is an advisor whose job is to go out and learn some information about these returns at a cost, as well as to give advice for the investment. Okay. And in this model, there is so both parties are risk neutral, and there is a limited liability constraint. So the payment made to the agent in period T can't be less than 0, and it also can't be more than the total end of period wealth. So this wealth is going to be consumed somehow. It's going to disappear. So this constraint prevents us from just using the sell the firm to the agent kind of solution. So what do we assume about the stochastic structure of the investment returns or the information acquisition opportunities? Well, Chassaing assumes nothing about them. Okay, so investment returns don't have to be IID over time. It could be that the returns are the same for a large number of periods. And similarly, about the information acquisition opportunities, it might be that by spending some cost in period T, the agent can learn something about period T's returns. But maybe by spending a cost in period 1, the agent learns about the returns from period 100 onwards. Okay, so this is a very general model. And at this level of generality, there's no hope of being able to say anything about what the optimal contract looks like. Here, I mean optimal contract in the usual sense of maximizing the principal's expected payoff from the investment minus whatever she has to pay to the agent. So instead of looking at the optimal contract, Chassaing considers a benchmark contract, which is possible to write down but not feasible in this model. So he says, suppose the principal wants to pay the agent a linear contract where he just pays some fraction alpha of the excess return that the agent generates. So each period, the agent makes a recommendation about how to invest. The principal would like to pay alpha times whatever return she earns on that minus the return that she would have gotten ex post if she had just made the investment decision on her own using whatever information she has by herself and not hiring the agent. And this is something she can compute because Chassaing assumes that at the end of the period you can look back and see the realized return on each asset. So this kind of contract, it aligns incentives, right, in the sense that if the agent is doing well, the principal is also doing well. If the agent's doing badly, the principal is doing badly, right? The agent gets rewarded for helping the principal do better than she could do on her own and punished for doing worse. But this is not feasible because it violates limited liability, right? In the realizations where the agent's recommendation does worse than the principal's default, the principal is supposed to punish the agent by paying negative, but the limited liability constraint rules that out. So the goal of this paper is to figure out how to get close to the payoff that the principal would get from this benchmark contract, but satisfy the limited liability constraint. And so Shasong shows how to do this using tools from the no-regret learning literature, going back to Hannon and Blackwell in the 50s. So the idea is pay the agent linear in his performance relative to the default, except if he does worse than the default, you can't pay him negative, so you just pay 0. And then if today the agent does worse than the default, then tomorrow you reduce the amount of wealth that is allocated according to the agent's recommendation. So in period t, you invest fraction lambda t of the wealth in the agent's recommended portfolio, and the remaining fraction 1 minus lambda t in the default. And you adjust lambda t up or down over time depending on how the agent has performed in the past. The agent would like lambda t to be big because that will enable him to earn the largest share of the reward, the benefit from his recommendation. So you can't punish him by paying negative, instead you punish him by shrinking lambda. And Shasong shows that with n periods, the payoff from this contract approximates the benchmark to within 1 over root n factor per period. So that means if you have a long time horizon, you can get very close to the infeasible benchmark contract in per period terms. So I present this as an illustration of what one can do with very little structural assumptions on the environment. Forget about looking for the optimal contract. Instead, identify sort of specific barriers and specific technical tools to get around them. So this is one idea of what mechanism design tools for weakly structured environments might look like. Okay, let me now be a little bit less wild and closer to home, perhaps, closer to my own work, which I may or may not be home. I'll talk about robustness and mechanism design. And as I said, I'll describe a few examples from this recent growing literature, and I'll try to talk also about how this sort of fits into the more general idea of weakly structured environments. But first of all, I should probably say something about what I even mean by robustness in mechanism design, right? So what is this field? Okay, well, first of all, what is mechanism design? One working definition of mechanism design is about the design of incentives for strategic agents. And generally, the agents hold private information, right? There's some sort of information asymmetry in order to have interesting incentive problems. Okay, so if we write down mechanism design problems, we have to have some way of modeling the information that is unknown to the designer. The usual approach in economic theory and in much of traditional mechanism design, a la Meyerson, Musa-Rosen, and so forth, is to say, well, we have some prior over it and we maximize expected utility. Right? So that's what I'll call the standard approach here. Right? In robust mechanism design, instead, we say, well, at least some aspect of the environment is described in non-probabilistic terms. So there's something that we can't even formulate a prior over, and instead we have some set of possibilities, and we have maybe a max-min or min-max regret type objective. There is lots of work out there on mechanism design with max-min objectives. Why do I need to give it this fancy name robust? Why did I just say problems with max-min objectives? So I think robust is not really part of the model, it's part of the interpretation, right? So we write down economic models, we intend to extract some lessons from them, and so the term robust here I'm using to sort of describe the kinds of lessons that we think that these models, or at least some of them, can teach us. And maybe I'll come back to that after talking through a few examples. Okay, so here's a first example of a robust mechanism design problem. This is due to Alex Frankel. So this is a problem of delegation with multiple decisions. So in this paper, there are n decisions to be made, and in each decision there is a state of the world, and there is an action to be taken. And the agent privately knows these states of the world, theta 1 through theta n. The principal wants to find out that information and take action, so A1 in problem 1, A2 in problem 2, and so forth. And In each problem I, the principal has some preferences about what action to take that depend on the unknown state theta I. Right? So there's the principal's utility, right? UP of AI depending on theta I, and I'm assuming additive separability across the problem. So principal's overall utility is just the sum of these. And similarly for the agent's utility. Okay, and so the principal knows her own utility function UP. It's something with increasing differences between AI and theta I. So the principal wants to take higher actions when the state is higher. The principal doesn't know the agent's utility, but knows that the agent also has increasing differences. So this is a bit abstract. An example that Frankel gives is, think about it, the principal is a school principal and the agent is a teacher. And so the teacher knows how well each student in his class has performed, or have a numerical performance over the course of the semester, and grades have to be assigned. Right? And the principal has some preference over how numerical scores should map into grades, and presumably wants higher scores to map into higher grades. The teacher also has some such preference and probably also wants higher scores to correspond to higher grades, but the teacher may want to inflate grades and they may more generally not have exactly the same preferences as the principal does, and the principal doesn't know exactly what the teacher's preferences are, other than that he wants to assign higher grades to better students. Okay. Finally, we assume that the principal has some prior distribution over the states theta 1 through theta n. They can be independent, but they don't need to be. So there's some joint distribution. Okay. And so what is a mechanism here? If we talked about direct mechanisms, the agent would report the entire vector of thetas, and then the mechanism would specify as a function of that report the vector of actions, or possibly a distribution over vector of actions to be taken. Whatever mechanism is proposed, the principal will evaluate it by this max-min criterion, where she thinks about her expected utility under whichever type of agent is worst for her. Where when I say type of agent, I mean not the thetas, but the preferences, the UA. Okay, and what Frankel shows is very generally the optimal mechanism for the principal is what he calls a ranking mechanism, which basically specifies a number of times that each action should be chosen. So in the school teacher example, the mechanism would say you're supposed to give this many A's, this many B's, this many C's, and so forth. If the principal offers such a mechanism, she knows exactly how the agent will behave, right? The teacher will give the A's to the best students, the B's to the next best students, and so forth, because of this increasing differences assumption. Right? And so it's a sort of natural candidate for the max-min optimal mechanism, because the agent's behavior is predictable in spite of the uncertainty about exactly what his cardinal preferences are. Right? And so Frankel shows that, in fact, this is the max-min optimum. Okay, here's another example of robust mechanism design, this time from my own work. So this is a moral hazard problem, and this is unlike the dynamic problem we talked about earlier, this is a very simple static model. Okay, so there is a principal and agent, both risk neutral, and there's going to be a limited liability constraint. So if you're the principal, you can't pay the agent less than 0. Okay? So as usual in moral hazard problems, the agent's going to take some hidden action that produces output according to some distribution at some effort cost to himself. And the principal can offer a contract that says payment as a function of observed output, and the payoffs are the usual, right? So for the principal, our payoff is output minus the payment to the agent. Agent gets what he's paid minus his effort cost. So historically, the sort of standard approach to modeling these situations has been something like assume effort is one-dimensional, and the distribution of output generated by each effort level. If I think about even about sort of static incentive problem, it's very hard to think of examples of situations where somebody needs to be incentivized and the only choice that they're making is one-dimensional effort, right? So I want to move away from that and say instead what the agent does is an action. And I can conceptualize an action as a complete contingent plan, right? A full description of what the agent does, arrives at work at 9:03 in the morning, reads the news, gets his morning coffee, writes code for an hour, see if it compiles, etc. Of course, all I care about is the payoff relevant parts of the action, which is the output distribution and the cost, right? So an action here is just modeled as a distribution of output and a cost. And the assumption here is if you're the principal, you know about some actions that the agent might be able to take, but you don't know everything the agent can do, right? So the agent can do certain things that are understood by you. He might have other options, and you don't really know what those other actions that might be out there are, or how many of them there might be. And so again, you'll use a max-min criterion to evaluate possible contracts, right? So you think about a contract to offer the agent, you'll ask, what is my expected profit in the worst case over the possible unknown actions that the agent might have available? Yes?
So for example, we always have the same cost C to see the output no matter which action we choose.
Every action has its own cost C. Sorry, so. Yeah, so an action is described both as an action is an ordered pair that consists of a probability distribution over output and an effort cost to the agent.
Okay, but the cost is constant, so we can take it out of the expectation.
Oh, I see. So the cost doesn't have to be constant. The cost can also be random, but it doesn't matter because the agent is risk neutral with respect to money. I guess the cost, you can either interpret the cost as money or you can interpret the cost as effort, but the assumption is the agent only cares about the expectation. So if you like, you can interpret C as the expected cost to the agent rather than deterministic. Yeah. Okay, so here is the setup. And so if you're the principal in this problem, what can you do? Well, so one thing you could do is, again, offer a linear contract, right? And you can calculate simple guarantee from a linear contract in spite of not knowing all that much about the agent's options, right? So if you say, are the principal, you pay the agent 1/4 of whatever output he produces. If you say, okay, I know that the agent has some particular action he can take that's going to give him an expected payoff of 1,000, the agent might have other actions out there, you don't know what they are, but whatever he does, he's going to get at least 1,000, right? Because he is optimizing. And if you're giving him 1/4 of the output, you're keeping 3/4 for yourself. That means if he gets at least 1,000, you must be getting at least 3,000. So you can calculate a guarantee on your own expected payoff with very little information about what the agent's possible actions are. Okay, and so the result of this paper is basically that the linear contracts are in fact optimal in this max-min problem. Essentially, with enough uncertainty about the agent's possible actions, the only thing you know is this lower bound on the agent's expected payoff. The only useful way to turn that into a guarantee for yourself is a linear relationship between the two payoffs. Next example, also from my own work, this is a multi-dimensional screening model. So the model here is pretty general, but for simplicity today, I'll just talk about sort of leading special case, which is a multi-good monopolist problem. Okay, so let's think about a seller of multiple goods who faces a buyer whose values for the goods are unknown and is trying to maximize expected revenue. Okay, and avoid making things more complicated than necessary. The buyer is going to have quasi-linear preferences, and the values are just additively separable across goods. Okay, and the buyer's value for good I is theta I, which is drawn from some prior distribution Fi. So most of the literature on the sort of versions of this problem has assumed like the values are, say, independently drawn across goods. Often they're even IID. And ask what the optimal mechanism looks like. And one robust finding from this literature, robust not in the sense that I'm using it here, but widespread finding in this literature is that you typically want a bundle. Right? There is a paper by, I think, McAfee, Macmillan, and Winston in '89 that shows quite generally optimal. So you offer maybe a price for each good, but then you sell the bundle of goods at a price that might be more or less than the sum of the separate prices. In fact, you can do even better by using probabilistic mechanisms, right? So offering the agent the chance, 3/4 chance of getting one good and a 5/8 chance of getting another good by paying some price. And in fact, we have solved examples in the literature where the optimal mechanism involves offering a menu of infinitely many different probabilistic bundles at different prices. So those kinds of results are certainly technically impressive. They're also perhaps counterintuitive, right? And we might say, well, we don't really, when do you ever really know enough about the distribution of agents' values to be confident in using this kind of infinite bundling mechanism? And in particular, it seems like sort of the simplest thing to do is to just sell each good separately. It's a little bit odd that the simplest model that one might write down seems to not predict that. Okay, so here is a model that does. Instead of assuming that the values for the goods are independently distributed or anything else about the joint distribution, let's just say the seller doesn't know what the joint distribution is, right? So if you're the seller here, you know the marginal distribution of values for each good, but you have no idea how they're correlated across goods. And so when you think about some selling mechanism, you ask, what is the revenue that you'll get in expectation under whatever the worst possible correlation structure is? And so the result is indeed that there it's optimal to just sell the goods separately, post a price for each good. And here again, sort of this is I think a very natural guess for what the maximum mechanism looks like, because if you sell each good separately, then to figure out your revenue, you only need to know the distribution of values for each good. In fact, you don't even need that, right? You just need the probability that the buyer buys each good at the price you've offered. You definitely don't need to know what the correlation structure is. Nonetheless, getting from that intuition to the proof of the theorem is not all direct. So in the paper, there's an argument that actually constructs a particular worst case joint distribution where there's no way to do better than selling the goods separately. I think I have time to talk about one more example, at least briefly. This is one of my favorite papers by Kim So-chung and Jeff Feely in 2007. They are interested in the question of whether we should use dominant strategy mechanisms. All right, so there is a sort of folk wisdom that I think many of us really subscribe to it at some level, that dominant strategy mechanisms or strategy-proof mechanisms, we might call them, are good to use because you can predict how people will behave in a strategy-proof mechanism without knowing anything about what they believe about the other participants in the mechanism. Okay, so dominant strategy mechanisms are predictable. On the other hand, it's rarely, if ever, clear that predictability is really what we want, right? Usually we care about welfare or about revenue or some such objective. And if you're trying to maximize revenue, let's say, what do you care whether people's behavior in your mechanism is predictable? Revenue is the thing that matters, right? So Chang and Ilya are asking, can we connect these concepts? Can we use the idea that dominant strategy mechanisms don't depend on agents' beliefs if the thing that we ultimately care about is, in their paper, it's revenue? Okay, so they look at a specific setting, the setting of a single object auction where buyers have correlated values. And this is arguably a natural test case for the question under study, because the sort of traditional theory answer to this problem, right? What do you do if you have to design a single object auction where buyers have correlated values? Well, Kramer-McLean says you can have the buyers make sort of these side bets about each other's values, and that allows you to extract the full surplus, right? And this sort of textbook answer, mathematically, of course, it's right, but intuitively it seems wrong. It seems like something we would never use in practice, and perhaps the foremost reason why we wouldn't use it as well, it relies on very strong assumptions about what agents' beliefs about each other are. right? And so it's natural to now say, okay, what if we don't know what people's beliefs are, and we want to be somehow robust to that? Would that lead us to use dominant strategy mechanisms instead, or would it lead us somewhere else? Okay, so once we've asked that question, it's kind of natural to translate that to a max-min problem, as these authors do, right? So they say, okay, you're the seller in this auction. You have a prior over the buyer's values. You know what the joint distribution of different buyers' values is, and they're correlated with each other. But you don't know what the buyer's beliefs are about each other, or their higher order beliefs. And those beliefs could be anything at all. They don't necessarily come from a common prior even. Okay? And so when you think about a mechanism you could offer the buyers, you're going to evaluate it by your expected revenue in the worst case, where the expectation is with respect to the buyer's values, and the worst case is over the beliefs that the buyers might have. Okay, so as I've described, this is sort of a natural test case scenario to ask whether dominant strategy mechanisms are in fact robust to beliefs. What is a dominant strategy mechanism here? Right, so basically they characterize in the paper the optimal dominant strategy mechanism in this setting. Basically it offers each agent, each buyer, the chance to buy at some price where the price that's offered to one buyer depends on the other buyer's reports. And so, you know, if one buyer is above their posted price, then they get to buy the good. And these prices are constructed in such a way that you'll never have more than one buyer above their price. Okay, so what do they find? Under a particular regularity condition on the joint distribution of values, indeed, dominant strategy mechanisms solve their max-min problem. And in fact, they show this by constructing a particular worst-case belief, right? So if you use a dominant strategy mechanism, you know how the buyers are going to behave. No matter they're going to report their value truthfully, no matter what they believe about other buyers. So your revenue doesn't depend on what their beliefs are. And these authors construct a particular belief where you cannot do better than a dominant strategy mechanism, which shows that they solve the max-min problem. But they also show that in some cases this fails. So if we go outside of the region of parameter space defined by the regularity condition, then there might actually not be any worst case belief that justifies a dominant strategy mechanism. And in fact, the question of whether dominant strategy mechanisms solve the max-min problem is left open. So this gives both a positive and negative answer to the question of whether we can justify dominant strategy mechanisms through this kind of belief robustness, right? And it leaves open the possibility that, in fact, in some cases there could be mechanisms that are guaranteed to do better than the best dominant strategy mechanisms, even though you don't know what buyers' beliefs are. And actually, when you think about it, there is a whole separate mechanism in design literature under the heading of pure prediction that takes quite seriously the idea that when agents have private information that are correlated with each other, then we could actually extract this information usefully by having these agents make bets about each other. I think as to whether these kinds of constructions can be useful and robust to arbitrary beliefs in this kind of setting, I think the jury is still out. And more generally, we can ask the same kinds of questions about other ways in which we are used to thinking that dominant strategy mechanisms are robust. So I haven't mentioned it on the slide, but I have a working paper that does a similar thing in a bilateral trade problem, looking at agents who have the opportunity to acquire information about each other as well as block or help each other's information acquisition. And there too, the finding is that for some parameters, a dominant strategy mechanism solves the appropriate max-min problem, but for other parameters, we can do strictly better. Okay, so those are a number of examples of robust models in mechanism design. I guess now it's time to sort of relate this back to the agenda that I described at the beginning, this idea of weak structure. So how are these related to each other? Well, basically, the idea of weak structure is that there might be many things that we care about that are just hard to give simple parametric model of, right? So it's hard to give a plausible parametric model of agents production technologies or joint distributions of values for multiple goods. And we might say, okay, well, we'll write down a one-dimensional production technology because that's what we know how to do, right? We're looking where the street light is. But if we take a max-min approach, we can get around that problem. We say we don't have to write down any particular model. We don't have to commit to a structure. What kinds of ideas or what kinds of insights do these models deliver, right? So, one way of looking at these models is we take literally the max-min criteria. We say, okay, we now know how to solve the problem of a designer who wants to maximize their worst case. I tend to take these models less literally, right? Often as economists, we write down models because they're ways of expressing qualitative insights about the world. Mechanism design models serve to express qualitative insights about what kinds of mechanisms will work well in what situations and why. And from that point of view, Bayesian models where you're maximizing expected utility with respect to some prior are useful for expressing some kinds of insights. Max-min models express other insights, right? So Bayesian models help us to express insights about trade-offs that depend on the relative probabilities of different states of the world. Max-min models can be useful for expressing ideas about how a mechanism can perform well in spite of some uncertainty, right? Guarantee you some payoff and explain why that's the case. So if I think about the examples that I've just talked about, I try to sort of explain or to describe the central intuition in one sentence. In the multiple delegation model, it would be something like using a ranking mechanism lets us take advantage of the alignment of ordinal preferences between the principal and agent in spite of the uncertainty about the agent's cardinal preferences. In the moral hazard model, I would say something like the key intuition is that linear incentive rules tie together the two parties' expected payoffs, so there is no way for the agent to game the incentive scheme and do well without the principal also doing well. Multidimensional screening example, I would say this is maybe a response to earlier literature that had emphasized the importance of bundling. This is a counterpoint that says, well, if you don't actually know enough to see how to bundle, then you shouldn't bundle, and so forth. Okay, so I have a few minutes left, so maybe I'll just briefly wrap up. So, I've been talking about the sort of contributive value of max-min models, robust models in mechanism design, and in more generally about trying to move away from models with a sort of specific parametric structure. And this sort of overall agenda, I think, might be kind of old and boring to this crowd because social choice is one area where traditionally many of the models already avoid parametric structure. I think about the Aerobian aggregation setting. We let people's preferences be anything at all. Similarly, in like the two-sided matching literature, right, typically people's preferences could be anything at all. So I think the taste for general models is well established in this community, but not everywhere, right? So in many places in economic theory and related fields like political science, where we might hope for newer applications of mechanism design, we still see these kinds of very stylized, structured models. And arguably, these are differences of culture. They're not intrinsic differences, right? So in many areas of sort of applied economic theory, like IO, organizational economics, macro, and so forth, the reason that people have historically written down models is because they have some story they want to tell, right? So you want to tell a story about how alignment of preferences between two parties makes it easier to communicate the closer they are in preferences, the more they can communicate. You don't necessarily need to tell that story by writing down the most general model. Right? Often we start with examples. Okay. And so what I'd like to convey here is that there is possible gains from cultural trade here. Right? Like the opportunities come from taking these areas where people are accustomed to working with models with a very specific structure and saying, hey, we don't have to assume that much structure. What happens if we try to go at being as general as possible? What can we say? Okay, so summarizing, my hope for mechanism design to be able to inform applications in more areas is to have new kinds of models, and in particular, models with fewer structural assumptions than we're used to. One class of models that work in that direction is these robust models that take max-min objectives rather than imposing priors on some aspects of the environment. This is one tool in working towards the goal of developing new models, reaching new applications. It's certainly not going to be the only one. We'll need many other such tools. That's it.
So we have a couple of minutes for questions, reactions. So let me try one if the audience is a bit tired. So robust, I wonder if there isn't two meanings in the robust word here, because it can be interpreted as not dependent on certain assumptions about specific probabilities or things like that. But it seems to also convey the meaning of safe because of the max-min thing. So you could imagine something that doesn't depend on assumptions about probabilities, but would be a combination of max-min and max-max, for instance. That would be robust to assumptions about probabilities, but it would not be safe. So what do you think about that?
No, that's a good point, right? So we could certainly say, like, suppose we're maximizing for the best case rather than the worst case. If somebody wants to call those robust, I'm not going to disagree. I think we don't quite have a rich enough verbal vocabulary to be able to assign different names to everything. I mean, there's also the sort of local robustness literature as well, right? So the idea that something is robust if it's continuous with respect to small changes in parameters. So I'm sorry to be somewhat reusing words for lack of better words. I would love it if somebody had proposals for how to clean up the terminology.
Okay, so let us thank our speakers and prize recipients again. I would like to remind you that tomorrow morning, before the plenary, we have the general meeting to which everyone is invited, not just the members.